I don't know. Sometimes this.
Hello there. Today we're going to talk about The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, exploring the right and the left and how we can listen to each other, understand each other more. So, Rod, today you're going to kick us off with the 6 different moral foundations. So, Jonathan Haidt talks about different moral foundations that people on the right have, people on the left have. If we can understand them more, then we can have more constructive conversations. So take it away, Rod.
Okay. Well, Jonathan Haidt came up with a theory about there being moral foundations. The way we think morally is based on, in his view, 6 different moral foundations. And before we get into what those 6 are particularly, I just want to say in general a couple things that, first of all, he believes that these moral foundations are not intellectual or even really necessarily psychological, but they're more intuitive. Okay, so this is a much deeper level of attachment to our moral foundations than just mere reason or mere intellectualizing, right? So he did some great research over many years, and these 6 moral principles that he's found seem to cross cultures too. He sees them not just in Western societies, but he sees these same 6 expressed in different cultures all over the world, and I think that's an important point too. So he does he's very ambitious in this book, I would say, and he does try to make a case for some universal, principles. He also says that he believes we're pre-wired to have the moral principles that we have. This doesn't mean predetermined. It just means that, people are pre-wired to be more responsive to certain moral principles than others, or moral foundations than others. And he even thinks that there's a genetic component to this. He ties it into, the classic psychology, the 5 different spectrums of personality, one of them being openness to experience, right? And so liberals in general are more open to experience than conservatives are. More open to novelty and in lots of different ways. And so basically, these 6 foundations are coming from a very deep place within us, and aren't so changeable, right? They're not easy to change because they're so intuitive, right? I mean, it isn't just a matter of reasoning your way into a different kind of moral foundation. It's virtually impossible, really. Once you're stuck into a certain matrix of moral thinking. And I don't think the object of his book is necessarily to change people's moral foundations. It's more, as you were saying, to create a healthier environment where people with differing views can understand each other better, so we can have a better conversation as a society between the political left and the political right, instead of just shouting at each other, etc. So the 6 moral foundations are as follows. The first one has to do with care and harm. Okay. And so care has to do with, from an evolutionary standpoint, it has to do with, taking care of children, first of all, and for the survival of the species. And, he talks about like despising cruelty, right? And so care is something that comes up as one of the strong moral foundations. And this is particularly strong on the liberal side, right? They're very preoccupied with victims and caring for victims and helping the downtrodden and raising the downtrodden. And so care is very, very high in the conservative worldview. The second one has to do with fairness. And fairness is very important. It's very not important. It is important, but what I meant to say is that it's very interesting because the way that conservatives and liberals think about fairness is completely different. Um, for liberals, fairness means equality, right? So it's let's tax the rich more so that everybody's kind of at the same level. Whereas conservatives are more about proportionality, right? The harder I work, the more I should have, is their view, right? So fairness should be proportional to what you put in. So these are actually very, very different views of what fair actually means. And one of probably the chief, conflicts that actually of the world, between the worldviews of the liberals and the conservatives. The third moral foundation has to do with loyalty and betrayal, the opposite of loyalty. And loyalty is much, much higher in the conservative view, right? Loyalty is basically non-existent in the liberal worldview, right? I mean, and what I mean by loyalty is loyalty to family, loyalty to country, right? And we don't see a lot of that on the liberal side, right? Liberals like to say things like, "Oh, well, I'm part of the human race, right? That's the tribe I identify with." Whereas conservatives are much more like, I identify with, my family. I am loyal to my people. I'm loyal to my country, to my country's history. And so it's more partitioned in this. I guess the circle of loyalty is a bit smaller in the conservative view, but to say I'm a member of the human race, I mean, it sounds nice, but in practicality, it's not actually all that realistic at the end of the day, right? So loyalty is very low, almost non-existent in the liberal view, very high in the conservative view. Then we have authority, which also is high on the conservative side and low on the liberal side. And traditionally, authority has to do with church, right? God is the authority. In the conservative family, the parents should have authority over their children, and it's more of a hierarchical view that keeps society, very much locked in place in a certain way, but also creates very strong communities, right? When certain people in certain positions are regarded with authority. Now, obviously, liberals hate any kind of authority. They reject almost every form of hierarchy, and so authority scores very, very low on the liberal side. And this is another point of big conflict between liberals and conservatives. I would just like to add the caveat to that it seems to me that authority is actually waning a bit on the conservative side. I'm seeing, as at least in this country, as we're becoming more polarized, there seems to be less respect for authority on the conservative side, right? They're not accepting results of elections, for example, despite Congress, who is the official authority of our nation, saying that this is the person that won. And so I am seeing signs of actual breakdown in the authority spectrum on the conservative side. The fifth moral foundation has to do with sanctity and what is sacred. And obviously, this is also much, much higher on the conservative side, much lower on the liberal side. Sacredness sounds churchy and religious to modern liberals, and so in general, I would say that almost nothing is sacred in the worldview of liberals, except for one thing that he points out in the book, which is equality, right? So the notion of equality for liberals is a sacred value. That seems to be the one sacred value. Whereas for conservatives, a number of things are considered sacred, right? The flag is an object that is worshipped as sacred. I don't mean worshipped, but so things like that. This is why in society we see such huge conflicts, like in the sports arenas where the players are getting down on their knee, and this is so offensive to conservatives, right? And it's because to them the flag is actually sacred. It's a sacred object, and to disrespect it, it is really to them, quite a blow to their moral sensibility. And so, liberals again don't seem to have much that they consider sacred, except equality. But also, I would say on the far left, we see more sacredness in things such as like the New Age spiritual movement, right, where people go on, diets to cleanse themselves of toxins and that kind of thing. So there is, I do think there is some degree of sanctity on the left, but I don't think they consider it as sacred, since that word has such a religious kind of tone to it. And then finally, the sixth moral foundation is liberty. Okay, and liberty is something that both conservatives and liberals both score high on. They both have a high degree of that in their moral foundation, but again, it manifests itself very, very differently on the conservative side and on the liberal side. So for conservative side, the conservatives think of liberty as having the smallest amount of government in their life, right? Like, don't tread on me is their idea of liberty, right? And so, that's a very interesting point, actually, because on the left side, you have a strong desire and a strong impulse to make the government bigger, and to intervene in everybody's life. Basically, the way I see liberalism is there's a strong impulse to want the government to really take care of the people in every aspect of their life, not just, let's collect taxes and redistribute it, but they want programs that are going to, help people and all that. And, I would have to say that when it comes to that, I think, again, the conservatives are make a lot more sense, right? Because if you think about it, it's like magical thinking that there's going to be a big government that knows what everybody's interests are and what's right for each person, and they're going to intervene in the right way, and the right program is going to be there for this problem, when we can't even get the basics down, right? I mean, so I think that liberals really do engage in a bit of magical thinking on that one, that some government could be, both very powerful and just and noble and know exactly what to do for each person in each situation. And it does seem to me that the conservative side of just wanting the smallest amount of government in our life really does lend itself to to what I would consider to be true liberty. Now, the thing about the liberty thing, though, is that it's also tied into oppression, right? This is the opposite of liberty. And so the spectrum goes from oppression to liberty. And the liberals are very, very preoccupied with oppression, right? They want to raise the oppressed to an equal status so that everyone is equal. And that is their idea of liberty, to raise the oppressed to a point where they're no longer oppressed, which is also a very, very good, noble thing. However, on that side, it does require what we're talking about, that a big government that kind of, is sort of a goalkeeper for society. And so, so at the end of the day, one of the points that he makes in the book is that conservatives have a broader moral foundation because they make use of all six. They actually engage in all six, and conservatives are concerned about oppression, and this is why they want a small government, because they see government as tyrannizing and oppressive, and so that's why they're essentially anti-government, right? Because they see the the government as not being a force of liberty, and so they're very preoccupied with oppression too. So the conservatives make use of all 6 of these moral foundations, and liberals only make use of 3, which is care and harm. They're very big on that, right? Caring for the needy, caring for the injured, caring for the downtrodden. And they're also they score high on fairness, right? That they want everybody to be equal. Therefore, equality becomes their sacred value. And they also make use of liberty. But I think the fairness and liberty, those could really be put together when we think about, the fact that that oppression and bringing people to equal very much ties into fairness. And so a very strong case could be made that liberals are the only 2 moral foundations they have are care and harm and fairness, and thus this gives them a much narrower perspective actually on the world. And that is counterintuitive, right? Because liberals are all about universalizing and I'm part of the human race, and so at first glance it looks like liberals have a wider view, and in some ways they do, but when it comes to, but it's just not actually the case, right? Because conservatives are drawing from a much wider, deeper well, frankly, of moral psychology. So so the point of all this is that, and one more point I want to make too about this is that in my view, and I've said this before to people, and I haven't been successful in convincing people, but I do believe this very strongly, that conservatives understand liberals better than liberals understand conservatives. And again, that's another counterintuitive point. Liberals are, despite all their college education and their degrees and all their theories, and right, the reality is that they don't actually understand where conservatives are coming from most of the time. And this is why it leads liberals to become, to just start name calling and you're racist and all this. And they think that the conservatives are evil, right? I mean, that's basically what we're hearing these days. But that's really the result of not even understanding the worldview that you're opposed to. And so this book really opens your eyes to the fact that, if we did understand each other's worldview from this perspective, from these moral foundations, it could definitely help us have more constructive conversations about how to move forward as a whole nation. Because one of the things that he makes it very clear is that both sides of this pendulum, right, are essential for each other. Both sides want to just vanquish the other entirely. But if that were to happen, it would be catastrophe either way, right? I mean, what I'm saying is that liberals are all about change, and we need to change everything. And they need, even though they won't, they don't admit this, but they need the conservatives to put the brakes on that and say, well, wait a second, let's slow down here and, remember who we are as a country, et cetera. And the conservatives don't want to change anything. So they need the liberals to say, come on, man, we got to, things are changing and we need changes, right? So both sides are very much need each other. And I do believe that there is a way to restore a balance where both of them play the role that they need to play to create a healthy society. But as of right now, we're so far away from that healthy point, right? I mean, we're not even remotely close to that. We're just so siloed, and all that. And the last thing, and then I'll ask you a couple questions about what we can do about this and to move forward as a nation, is what we're talking about here. You can't convince somebody about your side merely through reason. Okay, this is such an important thing. You know, this is especially the fault on the liberal side, where they think they have, like, we have statistics and we have data and we have research. But what they don't understand is that these moral foundations are intuitive, right? They're not coming from a place of intellect. And so you can't reason somebody out of their moral foundations. You know, you can't use data, right? And I hear liberals say this all the time. Why do conservatives vote against their own interests? Well, the answer is they don't vote against their interests. They're voting for their values, right? And they're even willing to make sacrifices to preserve their values, you know? And so when people are voting at the polls, they're voting for their moral foundations, not because of some rational, reasonable thing that you can use at the level of intellect. And I think that is one of the most important insights I got out of the book, is that you can't reason. You can't just use mere reason to change a person's mind, right? You've really got to get to the gut. You've got to get to people's gut. And obviously Republicans do that much better than liberals do, right? I mean, this is why the loyalty to the Republican Party is so strong, right? Whereas Dems are just like, oh, you know, they'll abandon the Democratic Party in 5 seconds if it doesn't match their idea of what they think is right in the moment, right? So, so I think liberals would benefit a great deal by, you know, by thinking more about what's in the gut than what's in the brain, you know. So, so that's pretty much it. I hope I did justice to it. It's a complex book, right? I mean, this is a very, you know, I hope I'm doing him justice. You know, I think Jonathan Haidt did a fantastic job with this book, and I personally, you know, I've recommended it to so many people over the last 5 or 6 years, and I've read parts of it many times, actually, and I found it to be one of the most useful guides I think we have for this particular time in America's history, to move forward together as a country rather than just completely separate into, you know, 2 separate camps. So I really tip my hat to Jonathan Haidt in a big way. Actually, I think this book is a tremendous work, actually. So with that, Gerard, with this knowledge of the moral foundations, you know, you've read this book too, and I know you have appreciated it very much too. I know you've recommended it to people over the years too. You know, how can we use this knowledge to have better conversations and, you know, more constructive disagreements in our increasingly polarized world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the last paragraph of his book, he really explains it, that if you're talking to someone, firstly, what is the issue? Let's just take the death penalty, for example. And before you give all, as you said, before you give all the facts as to why it's such a bad idea, understand what is the moral foundation, or maybe 1 or 2 moral foundations that the other person's coming from. So, for example, death penalty, if somebody murders someone, it is fair proportionally, and that's from the conservative, from the right side, it's fair that they lose their life. Whereas someone from the left, the fairness is, well, no, it's not fair because only the poor people get sentenced to death. If you're rich, you can get a good lawyer. So we're coming from totally different sides of fairness. And if you understand that, it's amazing. I can now talk to people. I say, I understand where you're coming from. So it's very beneficial for me. Yeah. And again, welfare, same thing. For on the left, we're thinking it's fair. Equality is fair. We want everyone to have a, you know, good life. But from the right, it's not fair that someone who doesn't work gets money.
Right.
So once you understand that moral foundation, you can start listening to people. And he says the only way to actually, and people can change. He does say people can change, and the only way to do it is to have, well, one way to do it is to have a conversation with someone from the other side where you both understand each other's moral foundations, and you're listening to each other, and then actually you can start to bridge the gap between both sides. So people can change, even
Mhm.
though, as you said, genetically we are born conservative or liberal.
Mhm.
So yeah, amazing. It's been amazing for me, the book, since I read it, and I've just read it for a second time, and you get so much from it. Able to have conversations with people from the other side and understanding them.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I found it's made me way less judgmental, you know?
yeah,
And another thing I want to say about Jonathan Haidt personally is that he started off before he wrote this book as a liberal who hated conservatives and thought they were, all the caricatures that you ever hear on the left about the right, he bought into. That was his view. And he was he spent a lot of time in New York City, and he was very cosmopolitan and just thought, he spent so much of his time on university campuses and where everything's liberal and never even thought that there could be anything valuable in conservatism. And it wasn't until he started doing this book, when he did all this research, where he realized, oh my God, and it really opened up his mind a lot and made him see. I mean, he even says this. I saw this in a video. He went from thinking conservatives were evil all the way to, and this is so funny, and all the way to believing that liberals don't have, he said that liberals can't be trusted to govern yet because they just don't have a good enough governing principle. And I thought, wow, to go from conservatives should just be dead to liberals can't be trusted to govern is, that's a pretty broad shift in outlook, right? And of course, he still considers himself a liberal, so yeah, I've just found that it's really enabled me to not just see the other side better, but to actually incorporate some of the conservative, because I've been a lifelong liberal, right? I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up in a very liberal place, and my parents are liberal, and I'm very open to a new experience genetically. I'm very into change and all of that, so I'm just naturally disposed that way. But I've come to see that there are certain principles of conservatism that, you know, we should not tamper with until we have a very viable substitute, And
yeah.
so,
Especially the loyalty one is something I
yes.
learned a lot about. That we need groups to develop our virtues. He's done a lot of studies or read a lot of studies into that, and yeah, it is good to have groups, which is something I haven't thought about. And obviously, it is against those liberal ideas, but
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
And also with the loyalty thing, I've come to realize that it's total BS to have no loyalty to your nation, no loyalty to any group, and then say, I'm a member of the human race, and that's the only tribe I identify with. To get to that point, you have to go through the stages of loyalty to family, loyalty to country first, and you
yeah,
can't bypass that, right? Like in the spiritual world, we call it bypassing, right? Where you go straight to the absolute truth without doing any work on yourself, right? In terms of like character, character assessment, right? Um, it's just total BS, right? To think you can just skip right ahead and take this broad view, and so that was a big thing that I learned too with the loyalty thing. It's actually made me more patriotic, and knowing, and feeling that it's very important to love one's country, and that to not love one's country adequately is actually, in my view, a form of a pathology. You know, so that's that was a big thing, and then of course and then there's the whole authority thing, which liberals basically reject outright. Um, but everywhere you look, there are hierarchies, right? I mean, I think we have to distinguish between different kinds of hierarchies, right? There's domination hierarchies, which are generally bad, right? Where one alpha takes over and and tries to dominate people, and it leads to tyranny for sure, and it leads to oppression and slavery and all the things we've seen in American society. But there's also hierarchies of competence, right? Where like Michael Jordan is actually a better basketball player than anybody else, on the court. So we have to acknowledge that not every hierarchy is bad, and that they're actually useful, because if you're a professional basketball player on the court with Michael Jordan, him being that good is by nature going to make you try harder and get better yourself. And so, hierarchies of competence and skills are very valid. And what I see happen on the left often, not just with hierarchies, but with anything they don't like, they think the answer is just to get rid of it entirely, right? There's no nuanced discussion, right? We see bad hierarchies, domination hierarchies. Therefore, the answer is to get rid of all hierarchies. And that's actually not a good way to go about it, right? It's about weeding out the bad ones and preserving the good ones, right?
Yeah.
Or religion, right? Throughout the centuries, many bad crimes against humanity have been committed in the name of God. Therefore, the solution is to get rid of God entirely, right? Which, again, that's not, there is a good way to understand God and a bad way, right? So it's more about realizing what a good way that could be liberating, in that way could be, and understanding what a pathological way of thinking about God is, right? And I don't see any of that discussion ever happening on the left. It's just get rid of what we don't like. It must be vanquished from the species. We must eradicate this entirely, right? And it's so strange because that's a Puritan kind of ideal, right? And the Puritans are usually, considered more of a on the conservative side. So there is very much an authoritarian thing on the left, right? Where they do, despite we hate hierarchies, they actually want all the power anyway, right? So, so there's a bit of contradiction there for sure,
Yeah. All right, Rod, we'll wrap this up. That was great.
Yep.
So much more to say in this book as well, but
so much
that'll do for now. And I think just understanding those 6 moral foundations regarding any issue, then you'll find it so helpful to have discussions with people from the other side.
Yeah.
You'll know where they're coming from. So thanks for that, Rod.
All right. I'll stop the
recording
here. Yeah. Thank you, Gerard.